Hello Nyy'xai Planet Earth, this is Nyy'xai Coach, and this episode is about Nyy'xai Keening and stress lock. First of all, what is keening? Keening is the mechanisms and manifestations that come out of a given human design when it is being used in extreme fashion. Why is keening needed, or is keening needed? Yes, it is definitely needed, and the reason that is because you need to be able to push yourself to extreme. If you're an athlete, you have to be able to push yourself to get better. If you're studying something, if you're doing anything, you have to be able to push yourself farther than you had before, or farther than you thought you could go in order to do that. So there needs to be an ability to do that, and also to know what it feels like when you are pushing yourself to your limits. Okay, now this is serious stuff because you are pushing yourself to your limits, but you need to do that. It's important to be able to do that, and you need to know what it feels like to take yourself in that direction and what the degrees of going into extreme usage feel like. And that will vary from mojo to mojo because their powers are different, their hierarchies are different, and therefore as they stress their system, as they put extreme usage on their mojo design, it will manifest differently. In this context, it's important to actually use a term I'll call extreme modulation. That can happen a lot. Actually, extreme modulation and extreme momentum, because there are two things that can cause keening. They can come from momentum powers, as in Nyy'xai, Ni and Jai, which is if you get them going excessively and you don't channel them down the peak pathway, you just keep revving them up, but you don't have the engine going somewhere, things can happen. You can put the system too far. But it doesn't mean it's a bad thing, because that's actually the same spectrum that has the RPMs in an engine going really, really high as you push the engine. So when you push your big engines, there is a sort of shaking of the psyche, of the being, as you go to maximum capacity. That's a good way of looking at it. It's sort of like how your ship shudders and shakes as it deals with extreme momentum or extreme modulation. So extreme momentum is sort of like your engine's going really, really, really hard and strong at peak capacity. Extreme modulation would be you are hitting the brakes and your car is shaking as you're attempting to just brake or maybe hold a curve and not slide off the road. So kind of like brakes and suspension, you think of it in this context, are what's going to keep it from going off the rails. Of course, if you keep taking the engine into the red, you can actually take it past the red and things start actually breaking down. Then you also, with say brakes or suspension system, you can actually be holding that cornering, and then you can't hold anymore. It starts to lose control. So keening is that point at which you are in danger of losing control, but that doesn't mean you have lost control. And then there is, you are starting to lose control, and that happens in degrees. So there is feeling that loss of control is coming up, coming to that point of no return of loss, not no return, but of where you're going to start taking penalties. Like an RPG game, if you go any further, you'll be penalized for taking more stress, either modulation stress or momentum stress. To distinguish, we're going to use extreme as not a bad thing. That's just really intense. So extreme momentum is just intense momentum, but then you have over momentum. That implies too much. Then with modulation, you're going to have extreme modulation, but that is okay as long as you don't go into over modulation. That's bad. How should you interpret this then? You should interpret keening in the same way you would the signs of fatigue or either mental or physical exhaustion. So if you are pushing yourself to work out, you're pushing yourself to study, you need to know your limits. But you don't actually want to not push yourself, because then you wouldn't actually reach your potential, you wouldn't grow. So it's something you want to kind of work up to, kind of go into the gym for the first time. As you learn what is taxing your system, you can do it in increments to learn what your limits are, and then go each day and try to do it a little more and work past what you thought was previously your limits. As a Nyy'xai, a great way to do that would be, for example, mojo reading. Is when you first start mojo reading, you're going to get fatigued quickly. But then over time, that will get to where you can go longer and longer and read deeper and deeper without getting fatigued. But to do that, you'll have to read to fatigue and then recover from it. So I really do think like thinking of it as like a workout or any kind of regimen where you don't want to overtrain, but you don't want to undertrain. And if you come at it that way, then you should be good to go. Use the same kind of protocol, same kind of like, okay, I want to safely increase my intensity of a new exercise I haven't tried before. But then once I actually figure out what the groove is and now I know kind of where I'm at, I start trying to increase until I hit a point where I'm like, okay, I think that may be too intense or too strenuous, that might be injurious to me. Pretty much the same kind of thing. Let's go for the Nyy'xai, the powers that you have. You're going to have Ni is going to give you momentum. So when you do cross-contextualizing and things like that, that's going to gain momentum for you. At some point you'll need to do something with the momentum, but as long as you're feeding on cross-contextualizing, you'll kind of get more and more energy. This is going to give you the general buoyancy, which is great. But if you go too far, it can go into like a mania. When it starts getting into a bit of mania, that might be an issue. But it's important to note that it's not just sort of like a cutoff. There's like degrees. And so let's talk a little bit about those degrees. The first degree is, with Ni, is fantasizing. So fantasizing is very good. So as you get a lot of momentum going, you're going to start being a bit casual with the environment. It doesn't actually mean as much to you. You're really getting your Ni going, so you're not feeling V or anything like that. You're actually feeling, or Vi or anything like that, you're feeling like being in the story you're in. And as you are in the environment, you're basically acting out some sort of fantasy, or at least you're experiencing it for yourself. And so when that happens, you're not going to pay attention to a lot of details other people might think are important. So that's okay, because that lets you be buoyant. That lets you actually have these cool fantasies. So that's not a problem. It can become a problem when it goes too far or is used the wrong way, because then you are going to be fantasizing and not paying attention to stuff that maybe you should be. But this gets to be like the situation. So it's not bad that Nyy'xai, when they get going, tend to start fantasizing and losing track of the environment a bit. At least as far as like details. You're kind of like just sort of floating around in it. That's not bad, but you have to make sure that you're floating at the right times. Continue with the floating, we go with fairy flight. That's the next one. This is when, as a Nyy'xai, you start getting really worked up. You start wanting to grab people and things and get them to join and get communication going and get action going and just create excitement. That's really good. But you can see it's a little more manic-y now, but the upside is you can get people off couches that were really going to be lumpy because you're just so worked up and excited. So that's really, really cool. But it can get to where you are being a bit clumsy or maybe a bit shallow with people, or maybe even being a bit impetuous. Those were the first two like stages of Keening. Third stage of Keening for the Nyy'xai with the Ni. This is going to be, we'll call extreme momentum Keening. That is going to be the delirium. You may have heard in certain films talk about the delirious eyes that the Nyy'xai get. Nyy'xai do as well, but being a Ni Alpha, the Nyy'xai can get delirious. And they're like literally drunk on ideas, on possibilities, on things unfolding. And when this happens, they are sort of combining their fantasy world and this world as one at the same time, which gives them the ability to highly, move people and to be like magical creatures that are kind of running around doing these very interesting things. But the energy gets very, very sort of worked up, and there is a danger of the mania kind of turning into paranoia, or like thoughts being scattered and not being able to control them. It's just sort of like, and then we could do this, and then we could do this. And so the upside is it allows for a tremendous amount of excitement that can radiate from you out to projects, people, just everything around you. But then you have to make sure that it doesn't get turned to where it starts actually seeming like a delirious dance that's not fun. Next there's Nyy'xai. With Nyy'xai, it's a momentum power again, so here it's going to be extreme momentum. So when you are doing empathizing and internalizing, you're going to be getting momentum from your Nyy'xai. So as you think about, your poignant perspectives or positions on things, as you feel the plight of another person, both their maybe success or maybe a tragedy, these kinds of things, they build up Nyy'xai momentum, poignancy momentum, and this is a really good thing, and you should do this. But then it needs to be channeled down the peak pathway and done something with. Or not unlike adrenaline. Adrenaline comes in your system at certain times. It's meant to have your body do something, which is really good. But then if you don't do something with that energy, then the system kind of goes, oh, and it kind of like can shut down. So the positive is the more you internalize about things pointed to you, the more you empathize about poignancy and others, you're going to gain momentum. And at some point, it'll be so much of this poignancy momentum that it'll be extreme and it'll cause keening. Now, what are these? There's 3 degrees again. The first one is an intense desire for me time. You really want to have yourself some me time, and that's really good because, especially as a Nyy'xai, you can have issues with finding the environment so interesting and it's calling to you so much that you don't take care of yourself. So it's kind of good that your Nyy'xai, when it gets worked up, it tells you to come in and kind of look at yourself and make sure you're doing good. So it's like a magnetic pull inward, and it'll literally pull you away from other things that may have even attachment to you, and that's actually a good thing. Bad part can be is that if this isn't controlled, the energy isn't processed, you can stay inside too long, which becomes depressing, and also you become very sensitive to people interacting with you, which isn't good. Second degree of keening for the Nyy'xai is going to be wildness. Wildness can be a very good thing because it doesn't let you be controlled. Nothing can control me, and that's a good thing when you shouldn't be controlled, which is an issue for Nyy'xai, having Z as a modulator. It's good that you have a wildness, and then that kicks on as your Nyy'xai gets going. For example, if the world was trying to incorrectly modulate you, you may have to kick up to a keening degree of Nyy'xai, and that means at some point, degree 2, you're going to get into a wild state. But that wildness is needed to kind of kick up the Nyy'xai to the next level. Obviously, wildness, you have to make sure that you aren't doing collateral damage to yourself or others that you're going to regret later. Third degree for the Nyy'xai keening is going to be purging. Purging is basically an intense desire to make oneself clean, pure, untainted, things like this that you'll do anything for it. So the upside is that you will exert yourself greatly, and you'll even remove yourself from things that would be considered maybe like, oh, don't you want that? But you're like, no, I need to be pure. So that's a very, very strong power. It's a very high power. So you can see Nyy'xai, you want to be able to do that power. It's very heroic. You can imagine a lot of heroic scenarios for that. But that is a third degree of keening. So this explains why keening is so important. Because if you want that ability, that comes usually from keening. An issue with this could be, if it was not done correctly, is you could do purging at the wrong time. You could misunderstand something or not do it from the best place, and you do a purge either internally or in your environment to help be pure, but it's not being pure. It's actually just doing a lot of damage that you're going to regret later. So again, it's a question of making sure you're doing it from a good place. Now we'll get to the modulation powers. These also can cause keening. This is going to be keening that comes from extreme modulation. So as a Nyy'xai, anytime you're doing organizing and articulating, the more you do it, the more you're going to be modulating. If you keep doing that too much, too high level, it can go to overmodulation. But there's a point which we'll call extreme modulation. That's where the keening comes in, and that's not unhealthy, it's just extreme. It means you have to know what you're doing with it. The first degree of keening for the Nyy'xai with their Z is going to be keeping score. So what happens then is that there's going to be a framework, because a lot of times Nyy'xai use their Z to help them organize things, to be bracing as needed, but it's not to keep score. They can actually use a lot of Z, as all Nyy'xai mojos can, without keeping score coming into the equation. Okay? At some point though, keeping score is important. Keeping score may be needed in order that you train hard enough. Like, maybe today you don't feel like staying on the elliptical machine or something, but you look and you see that, oh, that is going to be 2 minutes less than I did last time. I could do 2 minutes, a little uncomfortable, but I could do 2 minutes more. And what motivates you in that instance is the fact you're keeping score. You're noting that that would be on the trending, on your flow chart or whatever, that would be a dip down. You'd be 2 minutes down from last time. You're like, well, I don't want to be 2 minutes down from last time. So that motivates you. Okay, but you don't need to do this all the time, because that way of thinking is not something that's really favorable for the Nyy'xai overall, but it can be at certain times, like right then. When you're working out in the elliptical machine, it might be good. This scorekeeping can be done not just outside, but sort of internally, where you are keeping score of what other people are doing. For example, maybe you're thinking that a person's not treating you the way that they should or not acting the way they should, and you weren't sure of that before, but you're getting a little rankled, so your Z comes in, you're keening now. You're like, I think maybe I need to do something where I don't know what's going on here. So you start keeping score, you start keeping track of when they came in, or how much they contribute to the lunch, and so forth. And so that keeping score, it doesn't have to be negative, but it does make sure that you are doing the right things and that other people are doing the right things. The second degree of Keening with the Z for the Nyy'xai is going to be giving scores. So once you actually have a score, there comes a point where you may need to give it. Say for example yourself, where you declare, I'm this good at something. Now, that's not being egotistical if you're in the right situation where you need to kind of say what your credentials are, like I'm so-and-so and I'm going to conduct this seminar because of this, this, and this, and you kind of go through why you're here and also why they should do this and this and different things. Like you need to explain that to people. So for Nyy'xai, that can feel like really coming out of their comfort zone, but sometimes you need to do it, and that is a second degree of Keening maneuver for them. They also obviously relate to other people where you're going to give them their score, where you're telling them like, not just in your head, but you're going to say to them, which is more forward, more articulating, you're going to say, here's kind of how the game goes or how the system works or whatever, and here's where you are. That's very forward, and that actually is going to be a bit of extreme modulation for a Nyy'xai, uncomfortable with their system, but sometimes you really need to do that. Obviously, when this is bad is when the Z has been overworked or something, and so it's doing this when it shouldn't, or maybe the Xai is not in a good place, it's having the Z do this for the wrong reasons, but whatever, the Z is not doing it for the correct reasons, and then you're giving scores to other people, you're declaring scores that you have that are incorrect or inappropriate. So that's when it goes into overmodulation, stress lock. Finally, third degree is going to be making calls. So this is where you are going to make decisions that are going to affect the game. For example, does someone stay or go? Or how much does a person need to get an A versus a B? And then maybe a person is having a question of whether or not the way they did something counts or not. This is different than having a score of where they are now, or saying to them where their score is now. You're determining something's future. You're determining its fate. This could involve whether or not you use a certain business. It can be involved whether or not you allow someone to stay in a class, or whether or not you leave a class yourself. All these kinds of very dramatic decision making based on the logic. So at this point, it's going to be an extreme changing of the game, and that's necessary to do sometimes, but you want to make sure you're doing it from the right headspace. If you're doing it from the right headspace, then it's just Keening, and you have to kind of do a dramatic move now that's going to change things because it was untenable. So you can kind of get out of untenable situations by making dramatic moves, by making calls. You have to be like a shot caller. So you're going to call a shot and you're going to say, we're going to play it like this, and you're going to actually have the play go forward. That's a lot of responsibility, that's a lot of pushing, but it needs to happen sometimes, and it will be third degree of Keening for an Nyy'xai, but you can do it, and you can do it heroically. When it's not done for the right reasons, then you can kind of be seen as railroading people or ramrodding them, or even kind of like beating up on yourself with why aren't you doing this, and pushing yourself to say overtrain. Things like that. That's when it's actually not good. That's the stress lock. But it's Keening naturally, and that's when it's good, and that's when it's heroic. Then we have vibe, another modulation power. So here we have extreme modulation that can make for Keening, and if it goes too far, overmodulation, the stress lock. Things that stimulate this are obviously things going on with vibe, but you can think of like the permanent record and standards of excellence. There's a lot more to vibe, but again, like the other ones, kind of mention the things that really tend to set it off. So anytime on your permanent record, right, it just immensely starts making you keen there a little bit. So the more you are concerned about something being on your permanent record, more of it being like standard excellence, do I measure up to what is needed, that is going to involve your vibe coming on. Now, that can be a very good thing, because that's what allows you to become elite at something if you really want to. So vibe can be very important in that capacity, and Keening will be required. You'll need to push yourself. Whenever you push yourself, you'll be Keening. First degree of Keening for the vibe is going to be pensiveness. You can think like worry. People always say that being worried is bad. No, worrying excessively is bad, but actually there's a correct amount of worry that is good, and that can even get to where it is uncomfortable, to where you're being pensive for maybe even an uncomfortable amount of time, but perhaps that's the amount of pensiveness that's really appropriate to the situation. So that would be Keening, but it would be appropriate heroic Keening. if you are worrying excessively, obsessing about something that's not actually useful, that's not helpful, then that is where you are going into stress lock, because the discomfiture, kind of going to the gym, that discomfiture did not yield a healthier body, right? That way of studying did not yield better intellectual ability. So it's okay to push yourself if it actually yields the results that you want. If not, if it's making you less healthy, then that's where it is stress lock. The second degree for the Vi is being on point. So being on point is sort of like this meticulousness of being. And that's going to be modulation, because going into that mode pretty much automatically is going to be heavily modulating your bobble. But a lot of Nyy'xai, for example, will be using that when they are preparing for a stage performance or something, or even when they're staying on point during a stage performance. So they're making sure they keep on track of the important stuff no matter what's going on around them. So that's a lot of intense focus. That's a good thing. And that intense focus is even heavy modulation for them, but it's not unhealthy, it's not unheroic. Where it can become an issue is where the obsessiveness actually gets to where you can't flow, to where you're so worried or you're so focused on, make sure I do this, make sure I do that, make sure I stick the landing, make sure I stick the landing. You're so focused on make sure I stick the landing that you don't Nyy'xai enough to do the backflips. You know what I mean? You don't jump up in the air and do the other moves you're supposed to be doing, or at least not correctly or as well as you could have, because you're so focused on stick the landing. I'm supposed to remember to stick the landing. That is where being on point has actually become stress lock. But obviously if you didn't have that, making sure you keep that in your mind's eye, so as you keep working at momentum, you're like, okay, but make sure with that momentum I stick the landing. So being able to stick the landing under a lot of energy, that will take keening, but that'll mean that you'll be hitting your high scores, and that's awesome. But if you go too far, then that's where you get into the unhealthy danger area. But you'll live and learn, you'll find out what your limits are, and once you know what they are, then you become a much wiser human about how to operate yourself, how to use all your powers, the momentum powers and modulation powers, to get optimal results for your life, everything about it. Final degree of keening for the Nyy'xai on Vi is going to be an interest in longevity and morbidity. Now, thinking about this kind of things are naturally going to go away from what is momentum for the Nyy'xai, but they can be extremely important. Now we're talking about the third degree of keening on the polar powers. This is really, really extreme. However, thinking about what I'm doing right now for the Nyy'xai, how it's going to affect my life down the road, that can be extremely important when you start thinking about life and death. What do I want to do with my life? How much time do I have for this test, for this vacation, for my life? You start putting like timings on things. You start seeing like, the sands in an hourglass. That kind of thinking is very heavy. It's heavy thinking, but it can help a Nyy'xai go down the right spirit force creature path, the right possibility gatherer path. So it's not something you want to be doing all the time, but at the right moment, when it is correct to do so, you would want to stress your system enough to keen to where you are thinking about longevity of yourself, of morbidity, of that for yourself and others, to the point that you're actually making really wise decisions. You're making very informed choices. Obviously, if this is done too long, thinking about something too long term can actually make it to where like freezes you. The weight of it is too much, or it can make it to where you are becoming morose, depressed, to where thinking about it's not strengthening your resolve, it's actually taking away your resolve. So you want to make sure that when you're having that third degree of keening, where you're thinking about longevity, legacy, morbidity, that you're using it to actually propel you forward and it doesn't become a crushing weight. That's a good way to make sure that you're using it the correct way for keening and it's not going to stress lock. There's a lot to keening and stress lock, but I'll go over a few key concepts right now. One is the warning system. So warning system is sort of like the way that you will be notified if everything's going well, how you'll be notified that there might be issues. Okay, generally that's going to go from your momentum powers down. So your knee will start being a little off flavor. You're not going to notice much else going on, so you're still highly up on your powers and the knee's actually feeling strong, but starting to actually turn a little bit uncomfortable. That can be an indication. But that's also easiest for you to fix. So you're able to handle a lot of energy in that area. So if you start seeing that, oh, the knee is not as good as it could be, you can start adjusting it. You have a lot of abilities and confidence to do so. As it goes down from Nyy'xai to Z to Vi, it becomes more extreme to where you're being like, the psyche is alerting you. Like the Nyy'xai is going to kind of say to the knee, like, seriously, it's gotten whatever, the Nyy'xai is having problems. If the Nyy'xai is not taken care of, then the Z is like, okay, Z's kicking in here because we have problems. If the Z isn't handled, Vi will kick in and say, oh, so it's getting more extreme as it isn't handled by the person in charge, the source power. Another way of understanding it is actually in reverse, which is if you become stressed sort of acutely, very quickly, you'll start having parts of your peak pathway shut down. It shuts down in reverse. So what will happen is if you are hit with something or in a vulnerable spot, generally acute, vulnerable, energetic hits are going to go to your polar first. Your polar is the most sensitive to being hit by stuff, and it gets knocked offline. So it's the most sensitive to attack energetically, and it gets knocked offline the easiest. Then Z, then Nyy'xai, then Ni. So it goes from knee down as far as being healthily aware something's happening and having opportunities to do something before it goes to the next stage of severity. But then if you are taking damage, so to speak, energetically, and your system is shutting down, it shuts down in the reverse order. It shuts down from the polar going up to the source. The source is the last to go offline. It's because it's the strongest, kind of the heart of the synapse. Another important concept is fetishing. Fetishing allows for you as a Nyy'xai to use for anyone really, but in this case talking about Nyy'xai fetishing, it allows you to use high amounts of energy safely and efficiently. So this often has to do with your modulation powers, and that gets you to do two things. One is if you have fetishes with your Z and Vi, it means that when you do those particular Z and Vi, kind of your character sheet, it's like a specialized version of those specific activities. When you're doing those, you don't spend as much energy. So since you don't spend as much energy and you are higher level at them than you are, say, general Z and Vi, it's not going to send you into overmodulation as easily, because you can actually handle more on that particular specialized Z and Vi. Also, fetishing allows you to really line up your modulations with your momentum, which means you can actually kick up extreme amounts of momentum, and you have fetish designed modulators to handle that, specifically designed to handle that kind of momentum. So it's not just the Z and Vi of general, it's Z and Vi that you are particularly good at, and it's designed to pipeline down the massive amount of energy you're building up with your momentum. Another term you'll hear us use is locked up, which is related to stress lock. Stress lock means that you are actually doing keening to the point of overmodulation. You're taking damage, or you're taking penalties. You're losing performance capability because of it. However, once you would stop doing it, it would go back to being okay. Kind of like in the gym, if you're actually working too hard and you actually feel like a muscle's burning or you're getting a cramp or something, you can then stop and it'll get better. That's stress lock. You put it to where your performance is being compromised, but you can back off. Stress lock, or we often say is locked up, that means you basically injured yourself in such a way that you're going to need rehabilitation. You can't just stop doing what was causing the overmodulation. It'll get better on its own. You'll have to do special measures in order for it to get better. What are the special measures? Well, there's a lot to it. Popular theory deals with all kinds of aspects. It's an ongoing research project as well. But to start with, you want to go with resetting your peak pathway. And a really good way to do that is to do a few activities, such as mojo reading, such as hanging out with inspirational augmentation, doing other social alchemies like that. So mojo reading, your own temple, and hanging out with those social alchemies, it basically immerses you with correct math, and that can help reboot your system to go back online, have its factory settings go back in place, and the peak pathway will start cruising along like it was supposed to.